Number 2. Against the conclusiveness of this argument, it is objected that the Israelites were accustomed to use instrumental music at their option, and that especially was this the case on occasions of public rejoicing, when thanksgivings were, by the masses of the people, rendered to God for signal benefits conferred by his delivering providence. So far as the allegation concerns the employment of that kind of music in private or social life, it is irrelevant to the scope of an argument which has reference explicitly and solely to its use in the public worship of God's house. This will rule out many of the instances which are cited to prove the untenableness of the principle contended for in this discussion. There remains, however, another class of cases to which attention may be fairly directed, cases in which public worship appeared to be offered. In this class fall the instances of Miriam's playing upon the timbrel at the Red Sea, the welcome of Saul and David by the women with singing, dancing, and instrumental music, the like instance of Jephthah's daughter, the accompanying of the ark of David and Israel with bands of music, and the minstrelsy of the prophets to whom Saul joined himself. In reply to the objection based upon these instances, the general ground may be taken that they are examples not of church worship, but of public rejoicing on the part of the nation or of communities, with the exception of the prophets' minstrels, which will be separately considered. Some special remarks are, however, pertinent in regard to them. In the first place, it will be noticed from the account of the triumphant rejoicing on the shore of the Red Sea that the men sang only, quote, "Then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord, and spake, saying," unquote, etc. What can be gathered from this simple singing of the males of Israel in praise of God for their great deliverance in favor of instrumental music and worship, it is rather difficult to see. In the second place, it was Miriam and the women who used instruments of music on the occasion. Quote, "And Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went after her with timbrels and with dances." Unquote. The argument of the objector proves too much. If from this instance the legitimacy of employing instrumental music in public worship of the Jewish church is to be inferred, so may the legitimacy of its use by women in that worship. But the history of the appointments of that worship furnishes no evidence of the tenableness of the latter inference. The contrary is proved. Women were excluded from any prominent or at least official function in the services of God's house in the Mosaic dispensation. Here a footnote. The daughters of Heman mentioned in 1 Chronicles 25:5 were not singers or performers on instruments in the public worship, for they are not included in the enumeration of the courses which follows. It was the males of Israel who were commanded to repair to Jerusalem on those festival occasions when bursts of instrumental music were united with singing of praise in the temple worship. Indeed, so far the women taking an active part in that worship, it would seem to have limited, as to its outward expression in sounds, to the priests and Levites who, as the divinely appointed official representatives of the congregation, sang and played on instruments of music. The argument might do for a modern advocate of women's rights, but it will hardly answer for the Jewish dispensation. It is as barren of results as was Miriam herself of issue. In the third place, it again proves too much if the word rendered dances is correctly translated. It would prove that religious dancing was an element in the prescribed worship of God's people. The consequence refutes the argument. But to return to the general position, that the instances mentioned in the objection were those not of ecclesiastical worship, but of national rejoicing. Against this general view it is urged in reply that an unwarrantable distinction is made between the Jewish church and the Jewish nation. This raises the question whether such a distinction is valid. Were church and state identical? Did the members of the state act as members of the church? Did the members of the church act as members of the state? It may be admitted that in the main, that is, with certain exceptions, such as the proselytes of righteousness, for example, the nation and the church were numerically coincident. Ordinarily, that is, with certain exceptions, the rite of circumcision designated one alike a member of the state and of the church. But that these two institutions were identical, that the functions of the one were the functions of the other, considered as organisms, is, to my mind, not susceptible of proof. It would be unsuitable here to enter at large into this question, but it lies across the track of the argument in hand, and a brief consideration of it, as it is not illogically interjected, will not be regarded as impertinent. The question is acutely and ably discussed by that great man, George Gillespie, in his Aaron's Rod Blossoming. I shall give a mere outline, the bare heads, of a part of his argument to prove that the Jewish state and church, although in the main the same materially, that is, as to personal constituents, were organically and formally distinct institutes, and I do this the more readily because Gillespie's valuable work is now rare and difficult to access. They are distinct. Number 1. In respect of laws, the judicial law was given to the state, the ceremonial law to the church. Number 2. In respect of acts, the members of the state did not, as such, worship God and offer sacrifices in the temple, etc., and the members of the church did not, as such, inflict physical punishments. Number 3. In respect of controversies to be decided, some concerned the Lord's matters, and were to be ecclesiastically settled, some the king's matters, and were to be civilly decided. Number 4. In respect of officers, the priests and Levites were church officers, magistrates and judges were state officers. Number 5. In respect of continuance, the Romans took away the Jewish state and civil government, but the Jewish church and ecclesiastical government remained. Number 6. In respect of variation, the constitution and government of the Jewish state underwent serious changes under different civil administrations, but we cannot say that the church was remodeled as often as the state was. Number 7. In respect of members, there were proselytes, the proselytes of righteousness, who were admitted to membership in the church with its privileges, but were not entitled to the privileges of members of the state. Number 8. In respect of government, in the prosecution of this argument to prove the distinctness of the Jewish church and state, Gillespie takes the ground that there were two Sanhedrims, one civil, the other ecclesiastical, and he cites as maintaining that view Zephyrus, Junius, Piscator, Wulcius, Gerhard, Godwin, Bucerus, Walius, Pelargus, Saphingius, the Dutch annotators Bertramus, Apollonius, Strigelius, the professors of Groningen, Reynolds, Paget, L'Empereur, and Elias, cited by Buxdorf. The special argument Gillespie presses elaborately and acutely by more than a dozen separate considerations derived from Scripture, but as the question has been ably debated on both sides by men learned in Jewish affairs, no positive opinion is here expressed as to the conclusiveness of the proofs presented by the great Scotch divine. Number 9. There was an ecclesiastical excommunication among the Jews different from the penalties inflicted by the criminal law of the state. Such are the ribs merely of a powerful argument in favor of the distinction between the Jewish state and the church, by one who had the reputation of being one of the astutest debaters in the Westminster Assembly of Divines. The distinguished scholar, Dr. Joseph Addison Alexander, expresses the opinion in his Primitive Church Offices that the Jewish state and church were one organization with two distinct classes of functions, one civil and other ecclesiastical. But Gillespie shows that the numerical components of some of the courts were different. They consisted of different men. Take either view, however, and the ends of this argument are met. More conclusively upon Gillespie's, it is true, but conclusively upon both. What the state as such did, the church as such did not do, and vice versa. And if this be so, it follows that the same thing holds in regard to the people. What they did in a national capacity, they did not necessarily do in an ecclesiastical. When, then, Miriam and the women with her, the women who welcomed Saul and David returning home in triumph, the daughter of Jephthah celebrating her father's victory, and the mass of people who accompanied the ark in its transportation to Jerusalem, played on instruments of music, they were commemorating national events with appropriate national rejoicings. They were not acting worship as the church or as members of the church. In regard to the company of prophets whom Saul joined, it is sufficient to say that they were, in part, poets and minstrels of the nation, and that, as the incident occurred during the existence of the tabernacle, the incontestable proof, which has been already exhibited, that instrumental music such as that which they employed was not allowed in its worship, is enough to sweep all ground from beneath the objection now considered against the operation of the great principle of limitation upon church worship, for which I have contended. This holds good whether or not the view has been presented as to these prophets be correct. Their playing on instruments had nothing to do with the public, formally instituted worship of the house of the Lord. It has thus been shown by a direct appeal to the Scriptures that during all the protracted period in which the tabernacle was God's sanctuary, the great principle was enforced, that only what God commands is permitted, and what he does not command is forbidden in the public worship of his house. Moses with all his wisdom, the judges with all their intrepidity, Saul with all his waywardness and self-will, David the sweet psalmist of Israel with all his skill in the musical art, did not any of them venture to violate that principle and introduce into the public services of God's house the devices of their imagination or the inventions of their taste. The lesson is certainly impressive, coming as it does from that distant age, and it behooves those who live in a dispensation this side of the cross of Calvary in the day of Pentecost to show cause beyond a peradventure why they are discharged from the duty of obedience to the divine will in this vitally important matter. Number 3. The next step in this argument is to show that no musical instruments were used in the synagogue worship. As this is almost universally admitted, no extended argument is needed to prove it. It might have been expected from the jealousy which God has always peculiarly manifested in enforcing the principle that without an express warrant from him, nothing was to be introduced into the public worship of his people, and especially from the facts already emphasized, that no instruments of music were allowed to be employed in the tabernacle, and that they were included in the service of the temple only in consequence of explicit divine instructions to that effect. It might have been expected that instrumental music would not have been incorporated into the worship of the Jews on ordinary Sabbath days, not embraced in the 3 national festivals. This presumption is confirmed by the facts of the case. The writers who have most carefully investigated Jewish antiquities have written learned and elaborately in regard to the synagogue, concur in showing that its worship was destitute of instrumental music. What singing there was, and there was not much of it, in proportion to the other elements of worship, was plain and simple. In his great work on the ancient synagogue, Vitringa shows, here a footnote, De Synag Vitere, Lib 1, Pars 1, Chapter 10. Lightfoot on Matthew 6, verse 2. See also Josephus, Aunt Jude, Lib 3, Chapter 12. That there were only 2 instruments of sound used in connection with the synagogue, and that these were employed not in worship, or along with it as an accompaniment, but as publishing signals, first for proclaiming the new year, secondly for announcing the beginning of the Sabbath, thirdly for publishing the sentence of excommunication, and fourthly for heralding feasts. These were their sole uses. There were no sacrifices over which they were to be blown, as in the tabernacle and temple. And from the nature of the instruments it is plain that they could not have accompanied the voice in singing. They were only of 2 kinds, trumpets and ram's horns, or cornets. The former were straight, the latter curved. Nor is it to be supposed that the cornet, like a modern instrument of that name, was susceptible of modulation and therefore of accompanying vocal melody. It had but 1 note, and was so easy to be blown that a child could sound it. Moreover, they were for the most part used not even in connection with the synagogue buildings, but were blown from the roofs of houses so as to be heard at a distance. Enough has been said to prove that no instrumental music entered into the services of the Jewish synagogue. And here a footnote. The Orthodox Jews, even to the present day, oppose its use in the synagogue. The writer knew a congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, to be rent in twain in consequence of an attempt to introduce an organ.